Redfall feels confused, old, and unfinished. Worse yet, it's in a head-on race with Star Wars Jedi and Last of Us PC port to see who can have the buggiest game in 2023. Let me say this, Redfall has so many bugs for more than 2 hours we thought one of the bugs was a feature we just hadn't discovered yet. Despite a game about vampires versus mankind, Redfall's largest battle is with itself, and with dueling philosophies that never come together. Does it want to be a 4-player looter-shooter kind of title? And if it does, its options, presentation, and flexibility go directly against old and new classics in that genre. Or does it want to be a narrative-driven deep world? And in that way, it strangely finds itself looking into a mirror, and instead of seeing no reflection like vampires themselves, it sees all of the older siblings in the form of Arcane's prior titles. And it's just a bloated, unrelenting mess. The tight gameplay and level design and ideals of prior games are ballooned out in this into fattened, empty sections with occasional cool battles, somewhat fun missions, and interesting story elements, but they are so far away from one another that at times you're going to be wondering, what in the hell is anybody doing here? And will we all be dead by the time we actually get to something enjoyable next? Here's my review in progress for Redfall. It's an up to 4-player open world immersive shooter in a world where a longevity experiment has turned the already corrupted men and women of the world into vampires with many of the powers that you'd expect, but none of the romantic idolation. A game that left me unimpressed, unrewarded, and unlikely to suggest it to anyone but the most diehard random shooter fans. If you like the video, subscribe if you want, or continue not to, or thumbs it up and share it if you don't like it. Before we go on, I want to point out one really important thing. I'm a huge fan of a company branching out. Does this play identical to Division or Destiny or Outriders or Dishonored or Prey? No, 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 and no. It shouldn't and it wouldn't. However, the similarities and differences are going to combine in Redfall to create its own game, even if it does something better or worse. And that combined effort is the package. And Redfall makes you wonder where the effort went. While missing the dreadful fuckery of Outriders' brain-dead story chops and horrendous chopped-up level design like it was created on PCs with 4 gigs of memory, or Division's assortment of spongery in human form, sucking up bullets without so much as a stumble step in later moments, Redfall's attempt at 3 unique groups fighting over a mystical battleground of a town gone sour somehow feels like it figured out the most effective way to make 3 groups fighting over anything as unfun as possible. Redfall's story is about a longevity experiment that's caused what appears to be vampires to overrun the entire countryside. You and up to 3 friends leap into the shoes of characters in the game world, taking out enemies, missions, and all the undead garbage, and upgrading weapons and skills, all in a very typical service shooter kind of format. It hinges on the somewhat now typical triangle of enemies, groups, fighting one another, in this case those humans and vampires in a private military group, to make you always feel a little offset. Brought into the area to stem the flood of the undead, the private military group is consistently pretty much taking anybody out, regardless of any damage they may cause. And as you do more damage, taking all of the enemies out, you call attention to yourself, and that's when the big bad bosses show up. And one nice thing about Redfall is the weapon variety, because there is a good deal of it, at least within this fiction itself. Expected shotguns and handguns, machine guns from bullpups to G36s, and then flare guns and stake throwers, rapidly shooting an assorted Sherwood forests worth of wood at the human blood-filled hearts of the vampires. Or UV guns, sunburning enemies into somehow brightly dark deaths as they light up and then fade into black dust. Perks run the expected extras that do damage or more headshot hit points taken off or larger reloads, but later on, you're going to get some special ones on each weapon. And of course, getting those guns with a wooden stake at the end to take down a bad guy and shivving him in the heart, that's awesome, especially in combination with good skill use that you get with your characters. Now, regardless of what stake throwers, UV guns, or handguns you do pick, gunplay in Redfall feels at best acceptable. Not great and not horrible, depending on the guns you use. For example, the shotguns aren't that bad. They throw pellets downrange with the quickness, and the recoil and the violence that you want is actually there. However, rifles and handguns are less interesting, not really impactful with hits on the enemies, and a little too close to laser guns when you're playing in really intense gun battles. They don't feel horrible, but they don't highlight the game's gunplay in the best way. When it comes to the skills for each character, they run in basically 4 trees at first for each character, with each tree starting somewhat focused on particular skills or abilities, and then both drawing down, offering more for that skill, but as well as doubling out utility for some of those skills, sometimes stretching them out a bit, which will help 2 or 3 people with you in your group and giving everybody somewhat the same experience. However, I can't say the skills are exciting. For instance, Everyone can already get sniper rifles in the game, so you get this as a main power as well with one of the characters, and it's oddly like getting a ghost version of something that you've already got despite powers it can bestow. It's not surprising or that exciting. This odd overlap for the skills doesn't help. Working for a full hour through a main mission, finding secrets, taking out enemies, and then returning home sucks when you're faced with an upgrade path that includes more ammo can be held for guns, or more ammo can be held for another type of gun. The game's open map, or open world light, with 2 major locations you can go to. The neighborhoods themselves have many houses and huge buildings that you can explore, with side stories, hidden side missions, environmental storytelling, and groups of enemies to take out. This is some of my most enjoyable parts of Redfall for me as a personal experience. However, once you progress in the story a particular part of the way through and go to a new location, you can't go back to the old one. It's another odd decision in a game with a lot of them. Traveling around any location does get faster as you unlock safe houses around the game world, letting you teleport to them and take on some missions from within them as well. As night progresses, the enemies get tougher, and when you add in things like vampire nests, which already make vampires more difficult, then add those 2 together as well as difficulty changes, you can stay on edge and have to really pay attention, otherwise you'll die. Fighting with the same players and heroes also offers you something awesome, and that's building trust. Successful missions add more and more trust between heroes, giving bonuses to XP or speeding up revives. It's not a bad system. Like much of Redfall, though, it almost never works for very long. While the idea is sound, and sometimes you're going to come out of a battle between 2 groups and you can sneak by or take out the enemies one by one or just clean up the stragglers, the game is a goddamn buggy mess, and every time you try to do something like that, it falls apart. Frequently, the AI has huge issues, getting caught up on rocks, trees, lands, or just standing there dumbfounded like they're surprised that they're even there. Strangely enough, so do you. Redfall's movement system is not fundamentally flawed, but it's weakened by invisible small impasses that can trap your characters on the geometry. Let me give you an example, and the same one about sneaking around enemies. You try to do so across some rocks, which can find you stuck between 2 very small rocks less than ankle high, running in place, spinning around, trying to find the little bit of nav mesh spot that you can go to let you free from it. And unfortunately, the AI hits this as well. So far, I've found myself generally unimpressed as stretches of enjoyment get whittled away like the vampires you fight until one stake to the heart happens. Whether an enemy's AI glitch or the audio cutting out environmentally for a moment, leaving you in absolute silence, or some other odd issue like a disconnect from the server or the person you're playing with, or the AI grenading itself and its team to death all day, something always pops up. There are times when you'll come up on a military company and their unit is firing guns into the ground in front of you, in front of them, no enemies in sight. Or 2 enemies are shooting each other from 3 feet away, not hitting one another. Or spawning in and then despawning, then respawning over the top of one another. This continues with all sorts of other glitches. Sometimes, if you use a sniper rifle, the scope will be applied to every other gun in your inventory, from handguns to flare guns to UV guns, many times making it hard to aim and looking ridiculous. Other times, the entire weapon model is just going to disappear and never come back. While the world of Redfall is generally open, letting players move across those locations in whatever way they want, side and collectible missions that you can have, and fast travel, returning to the quest giver's main locations to further the main story as well, it never feels like a place you really want to stretch forth and explore. And when you do, regardless of your settings, it never runs that good. And let's talk about those settings. Arkane's games have always had a graphical flair to them, a feel to them, almost like clay sculptures look, especially with Dishonored, or the high fidelity but still artistically unique look of Prey, which is why most of the time Redfall is fundamentally disappointing from a graphical side. It's not that it doesn't look as good as Prey, because it doesn't most of the time. It can look worse than Dishonored, though, which is a game series a full generation older. And this is where the artistic choice really hurts them. Low detail vehicles are one thing, but sparse world design is another. And it means that even gaps in the locations don't have that lived-in apocalypse chic of Division 2, and it's just a mess of the end of the world. Instead, it feels like stretches of low detail landscape that isn't visually interesting to travel through before you get to the next inevitable enemy group of 5 people standing at a park table. This unique idea for artistic delivery isn't exactly reflected on the characters, which I didn't dislike their look. Able-bodied but somewhat generic character archetypes with a bevy of skins to collect, and some of them were cool. You can deploy them and unlock them through the missions. When compared to the larger stable of characters, though, in other games like this, Redfall falls ultimately to a single thing, a single player choice, and without a number of truly unique characters, repetition rears its head quickly graphically. What's worse is that the models, the LOD, the texture work are not only all rough, even on a 4090, the performance, while acceptable, is not what I would call optimized. And the options for graphics certainly are not generous. Now, it's got DLSS 3, which works for generating frames, but it is one of the first games where the latency is noticeable even with the boost on plus. In the options for the graphics, there just aren't that many things that you can set to really get that back up. This could also be somewhat related, though, to the fact that even with the mouse and keyboard, the game never feels just right. Like mouse acceleration is on, and it's just on enough to be bothersome. And then you add DLSS, and no matter how many frames per second you're getting, it does not feel responsive. Strangely enough, Redfall also goes for a very unique way in delivering most story missions, with no moving characters in the cutscenes, but instead odd freeze frames, almost like comics. I like the idea. It's got some great voiceovers there. I don't mind the style, but it doesn't do Arcane any favors in making the game look current. While we know the console version is shipping with 30 FPS mode and supposedly a 60 FPS mode later, it starts to make sense when you see how well or not well this runs on high-powered systems. It is a title that doesn't look great and really doesn't run great. Luckily, its audio presentation, at least in some categories, isn't bad, and they do help the gameplay. For example, the presentation for audio, especially ambient audio and environmentals, do a good job to help build suspense. Whispers and demonic voices filtering to you down stairwells, or hearing enemies thunderfooting their way across the broken ceiling above you, that's actually incredibly tense. Firing off shots, sending characters bouncing across the levels, and hammering out the electricity, explosive, and other environmental traps is all handled really well. Musically, Redfall is a very odd choice, though, and I can see it pretty much having no real middle ground if someone likes it or not. It's a mix of strange, almost hip-hop beats with occasionally more expected tracks. It's certainly a very bold choice. Nevertheless, it actually brings up one particular interesting facet of musical design in the game, and it does hurt it a little bit. Audio cues can be increasingly difficult to really understand due to the occasional musical switches and the style that they have chosen. Vocally, I liked it. I think all the vocals are fine. It is very cheesy at times, and other times not at all. It's got a good story, and that story and the beats that it delivers can be haunting. I had no problem with the voice. You just have to remember that this is the writing on the bee vampire territory. And when you collect all that together, and when I jumped in, this code coming in late for reviewers, and it may take longer to really glean the deep gameplay of Redfall, it's how it all came together, or didn't, that I started to notice I wasn't really enjoying myself. Like any trip, the destination is one part, but if the voyage itself is not that enjoyable, the entirety is brought down. Redfall's largest battles can be highly enjoyable, and the way missions are unlocked on the side is very rewarding. I felt surprised sometimes finding a story mission or being rewarded with finally opening some location by tracking down the story hints to a mission quest that weren't necessarily 1, 2, 3. I love that kind of stuff. Facing off against a vampire and its bosses getting more and more difficult is a test of ability, depending on the level of difficulty you chose, as well as good planning, especially when groups that you face end up building out with vampires that suck your energy, or a shield by spinning power spheres, and backed up by human sycophants in body armor wielding the same hardware you are. There's a growing number of times when it feels like a groggy morning, when this bit of fog is around everything pre-coffee, where sometimes you're just sitting there going, what exactly is happening? Nothing necessarily makes sense. And then one more bug interrupts a mission, when you have to truck through the same location for the 5th time with no enemies in it, and nothing of note really offsets that run. That's when Redfall feels ultimately, completely, utterly confused with what it wants to be. At this point, this is a review in progress because I haven't beat it and the review came late for a lot of people. The core fundamentals of Arcane games I like are here fighting against the expectation of both Arcane's games as well as the caricature-like status of games as a service. Now, they have stated that they're going to make it so that you don't have to connect online. That was actually the least of all the problems I dealt with. Overlaying Arcane's design to filter deep story and that world narrative to the gamer through primary narrative elements reinforced by secrets and double meanings and all of that Lost style mystery box kind of thing, they are at odds and never come together. Luckily, this is a Game Pass game, so if you got Game Pass, you can jump in and do this, but I gotta say, this is one more game that's been disappointing, whether it be Jedi, whether it be The Last of Us remake. There are a lot of these titles that just aren't coming together, whether it be technically or whether it be gameplay-wise. This is one that doesn't come together really as both. So anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys like the video. If you do, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumbs down. I'll update this later, whether, like I said, a video or a podcast. Peace out. Join the Patreon if you want.